The Idea of Communism by Alain Badiou, Judith Balso, Bruno Bastiles, Susan Buck-Morse, Costas Douzenaz, Terry Eagleton, Peter Hallward, Michael Hart, Jean-Luc Nancy, Antonio Negri, Jacques Rancière, Alessandro Russo, Alberto Toscano, Gianni Vattimo, and Slavoj Žižek. This is my analysis of said book. The title of the book is an interesting one. While at first it may seem boring, overly academic, and the obvious choice for a book on communism, it holds a deeper meaning when given context. At the Idea of Communism debate with Alex Kalanikos and John Holloway in 2010, Slavoj Žižek said that for Hegel, an idea is something that is not merely an idea opposed to reality, but something with the power of its own actualization within itself. Within this context, the idea of communism means not only communism as an idea, but the movement towards the actualization of communism, which makes it far stronger and more compelling as a title. The definition of an idea that Alain Badiou gives in the first part of the book is similar to this. He says that an idea is the possibility for an individual to understand that their participation in a political process is also a historical decision. The individual is a part of a new subject, and the idea makes them realize their position in the movement of history. Badiou defines communism as the most important emancipatory or revolutionary political idea, saying that it cannot be relegated to merely an ideological, historical, or political term, but represents a synthesis of all three, as it is an idea. This means that there can be no more talk of communist states or communist parties, as he claims, because communism should not be adjectivized anymore. He supports this claim by saying that history is not real, as there is no Lacanian real in history, and it is just a narrative existing only in the symbolic realm. This makes sense to me because communism has always been more than a party or a state, more than a political adjective to be taken up by one or applied to another. It seems that the only people who don't understand this are anti-communists who equate communism with the regimes throughout history that have called themselves communists and see communism as nothing more than an adjective describing the actions of these regimes. I suppose doing away with the adjectivization of communism altogether could solve this problem, as true communism means a stateless society where there would be no state to call communist, but it may still be useful as an adjective as long as it is understood that it is not merely what it describes, but it is its own wider idea. Judith Balso's chapter included less jargon than Badiou's, but ironically was less clear about the terms and what they mean to her, specifically the term politics or political. It's difficult to decipher what she means when she uses these words. She says that the communist hypothesis is a political hypothesis, and that this hypothesis didn't succeed in its objective, which is something that I agree with, and I think this is a good way of putting the fact that true communism has not been brought about. She defines an endpoint to communist politics, though, specifically the events of civil unrest in May 1968 in France, and says that it emerged as a decisive question for a certain politics. This is where the confusion in terms comes in. Regardless, Balso presents an interesting point later on about what she calls hyperhistoricism, essentially the idea that the historical progress of capitalism holds the possibility of political emancipation at its end. She says that this idea puts the natural progression of capitalism in the position of an emancipatory figure. This idea she calls hyperhistoricism is one that I have espoused in the past, but I agree more with her criticism that the current global circumstances with all of their crises show that capitalism is only going to progress into more capitalism. Essentially, capitalism is more resilient than we may have thought in centuries past. Balso also criticizes an idea she calls hypervalorization of the worker, or the social movement of the worker without the component of remaining political identity. She draws a distinction between the worker and the proletariat here, implying that the proletariat is not only a social identity but a political one, while the worker is merely the former. And she says that this idea is dangerous because it leaves no answer to the question of the state. It seems to me that what she's saying here is that the communist movement should be a political one without fusing with the state, so that the objective of true stateless communism is reached, an idea that I certainly agree with. It is clear that Balso's criticism of both hyperhistoricism and hypervalorization of the worker is that they throw politics and political organization to the wayside. It is also clear to me that both hyperhistoricism and hypervalorization of the worker are ideas that emphasize certain crucial elements of leftist thinking too much, these elements being historicism and the workers' movement respectively, causing another element to be expunged, that element being politics/political organization. I do not think this explains why explicitly communist politics exist only in the underbelly in our modern times. I think that is actually because explicitly communist politics are suppressed across the world, and the current neoliberal culture is allergic to anything that has even a somewhat socialist aroma. I do think that all of the elements of leftist thinking are important, and any explicitly communist politics should be guided by them in a balanced way, which means a reintroduction of actual politics into the movement is in order. Peter Hallward further elaborated on what Balso would call hyperhistoricism and why it is an incorrect and outdated way of viewing things. He specifically adds that hyperhistoricism basically demotes communism to nothing more than anti-capitalism, as it focuses too much on the destruction of capitalism and not enough on the construction of communism. This is because the history that communism seeks to overcome will forever be a hindrance if we wait for history to produce the inevitable outcome of communism out of capitalism. He also points out something that makes me ashamed of having believed in the so-called inevitable outcome of communism out of capitalism. The longer this belief is retained, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish between anti-capitalist resistance and pro-capitalist enthusiasm. It's clear to me that this is true, and that to allow this hyperhistoricism to continue dominating communist action, meaning essentially communist inaction, would be a mistake. He says that posing communism as an idea helps to prevent communism from being reduced to merely anti-capitalism in this way. Bruno Bastille's chapter talks about Lenin's criticisms of what he called left-wing communism or leftism, that being communism that stood against Marxist-Leninism. It seems that Bastille's agrees with Lenin here in some way, although it's as clear as I would like it to be about what left communism means. It's not as clear as I would like it to be about what left communism means to Bastille's and exactly what it is that he is condemning or trying to avoid. Perhaps it is true that I'm susceptible to being bogged down by political labels and categorizations too much of my thinking, but I am not a Marxist-Leninist, and to me, communism is nested within leftism, or what I would call leftism. This is actually why I would agree with the point that Bastille's makes about our post-Soviet Union world, and how, within this world, the dialectical idea expressed in the Communist Manifesto of the two classes, proletariat and bourgeoisie, has been purified, along with other essential communist ideas, into an anti-dialectical idea of the masses versus the state. This so-called purification is, of course, a perversion in all reality. The specific perversion of communist ideas is identified by Bastille's as massism, and appears to be a component of the left communism that Lenin criticized, even though there is nothing leftist or communist about the formless masses opposing a vague notion of the state and nothing more. The problem is specifically that it is formless, meaning there is no clear social movement or political organization involved, and that it is completely divorced from any discussion of economic oppression at all, while standing on the essential basis that state oppression is the only oppression in existence. This massism is of particular interest to me because it is extremely prevalent in our culture by my observation. It is a blatant contradiction of my anarcho-communist politics, which hold that oppression is the spawn that results when capital and the state consummate their dark marriage, and it serves as a footing for right-wing libertarians, which is why their position is ultimately so weak and misguided. Massism even pervades into left-wing thought, which is particularly annoying for me, but Bastille's writing clarified to me that it is a fundamental part of right libertarianism in a subtle and sneaky sense where they don't even need to espouse it for it to be obvious that they believe in it. Susan Buck Morse identifies herself as more Kantian in her philosophy than perhaps the other authors are, concerned in her chapter with the variables of space and time. She is also more openly critical of state socialism in her chapter, which is something that I enjoy because I think it is highly important to criticize state socialism, as it is not the goal of communist idea. She delineates how time has essentially been conflated with progress by groups like the USSR, and how they in particular utilize this conflation to justify their actions, like their destruction of the pre-modern cultures in the North. She says that Stalin's dictatorial power was based on this monopoly on time. This clearly means that progress and time are not the same thing, and their relationship should be understood in a more universal way rather than one being inevitably tethered to the other. And that if it is not, then it is vulnerable to being utilized for the contradiction and perversion of socialism into imperialism. She also explains how without communism or universalism, the neoliberal notion of individualism is the common antidote to the cultural particularity that goes on. The neoliberal individualism both confronts and constructs the cultural populism of fascist nationalism, fundamentalist dogmatism, and racist xenophobia, as she also describes. These are all apt points that the left of today would do good to digest and retain. Further points are made about universalism as well as the depoliticization of society by Costas Douzenas, who focused on the idea of rights in his chapter. He calls universalism the rallying cry of liberal humanitarians, which is more or less true, but seems to me to be radical politics bleeding into liberal politics and not the other way around, and therefore not intrinsically an issue. He also poses a deep question that in my opinion outlines an important distinction. If communist practice was a denial of liberal rights, can the philosophical idea of communism save human rights? The distinction this question outlines is, of course, the one between liberal rights and human rights. Liberal rights are not human rights, as human rights are a universal concept while liberal rights are an ideological version of this concept. This is vital when it comes to understanding communism in a genuine way. Communism stands for human rights while standing against ideology concerning rights. Douzenas describes another concept fundamental to understanding communism, and that is how the bourgeoisie rose out of feudalism, where power in the domains of politics, economics, and social status coincided into political dominance by suppressing political power. This was, as he describes, done by the privatization of property and religion so that they were protected from state intervention, therefore protecting class dominance, all through the formulation of the concept of natural rights. This is why the state holds the political power while true economic power is confined within the private sector. It seems clear to me that the next movement in this sequence should be to somehow move both these forms of power into the third domain, the domain of non-existence, as that would be communism. Terry Eagleton presents a more artistic and literary insight into the matter of communism, focusing his chapter on Shakespeare's The Tempest. He explains how Gonzalo in The Tempest presents a vision of communist society where nature resolves the problem of material being the only thing that can free us from material by taking the burden of ceaseless production while leaving humanity free of said burden. He also mentions how Oscar Wilde represented a certain point of convergence between communism and aestheticism, through the maxim of just lie around all day in loose crimson garments, reading Plato and sipping brandy, and be your own communist society, which produces a logical following thought that in order to do this, there would need to be a surplus of resources, which is an essential point of Eagleton's chapter. Eagleton overall highlights a relationship between art, humanity, and communism here that I enjoy, essentially saying that they are all one in the same, or at least in the same domain. Gianni Vattimo's chapter, entitled Weak Communism, is the shortest in the book, at only 2.5 pages, and consists of a numbered list of 9 points rather than a traditional paragraph structure. His first point is merely that the chapter's title is a banality because communism is weaker than ever as a political force in our modern times. But his second point elaborates that communism should be politically weak in order to rediscover meaningfulness in society before entering electoral politics. This is an interesting idea, the type of idea that posits a negative as a positive, and it becomes stronger with Vattimo's further points that communism should be theoretically weak in order to correct its metaphysical claims from early Marxism, and that Soviet communism was metaphorical because it was a war communism or a communism only existing in opposition to other forces like capitalist imperialism and counter-revolution. I'm not sure I agree with Vatimo's fourth point, which says that Marx and Lenin should be rejected, because I would rather retain what Lenin, and especially Marx, had to offer us, rather than throwing them out, since they are prominent pieces of the communist intellectual tradition. To be fair, the specific idea of Lenin's that Vatimo says we should reject, that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, is an idea that I agree should be rejected. However, I will not reject Marx's message. Vatimo's seventh point is one that I wholeheartedly agree with, on the other hand. He says that his brand of weak communism should take the place of the authoritarian models, and that a good dose of anarchism must be included. He states that this weak and anarchistic communism is better because the revolution does not mean the immediate, violent seizure of power, since capitalism is infinitely stronger than that. He says, it's clear that what this means is that this pseudo-revolution historically has been shown to lead to capitalism retaining itself throughout the resulting state, with the USSR as a historical example of this. He says in his eighth point that the left is called upon only to save capitalism from itself in today's democracy, which is a tragic truth, and that communism should now find a subversive course of political action while not giving up the few benefits of our current liberal democracy. Finally, Vatimo evokes Marx with his ninth point, saying that communism must be comfortable in the position of a ghost in order to authentically realize itself. This means, essentially, the anarchist praxis of avoiding all of society's institutions, including elections, which is something that I actually disagree with on the sheer pragmatic basis that to elect a social democrat will improve material conditions for people, as well as the political conditions of the larger society by moving the Overton window to the left and such. And that to elect a neoliberal Democrat or neo-fascist Republican makes these conditions worse. If Vatimo really doesn't want to give up the benefits of our liberal democratic order, he shouldn't push to give up the ability of our votes to improve material conditions for actual people living in our society. Slavoj Žižek highlights how we should approach communist action overall in our new era after 1989 in his chapter, doing so with a simile by Lenin called On Ascending a High Mountain, that compares a climber that fails to climb a mountain and now must return to the valley to a retreat in the revolutionary process, as Žižek puts it. Žižek's point is that we cannot continue upon the revolutionary process of the 20th century, but should instead retreat all the way back to the beginning in order to go on a different way. He goes full circle with the entire concept of the book by saying that this is the basis of how Badiou's restatement of the communist idea should be read, also pointing out that this restatement by Badiou should not be read in a Kantian light. This is why, contrary to Vatimo's opinion, Marx's message retains its relevancy. Communism should react to real social antagonisms rather than exist only as a dream that thrives on its own impossibility, as Žižek says. It's clear that for Žižek, communism is a reactive force that needs antagonisms to act against capitalism. He identifies four such antagonisms that exist in our current era: ecological catastrophe, private property being an inappropriate notion to be applied to intellectual property, new techno-scientific developments in fields like biogenetics and their socio-ethical consequences, and new forms of apartheid like new walls and new slums. He says that the last of these antagonisms exists in the gap between the excluded and the included, while the other three exist in the domain that Hart and Negri call the commons. But all of them share the characteristic of the possible destruction of humanity itself as long as capitalist logic prevails and encloses its commons. I think that these antagonisms are widely known about within the collective consciousness, especially the threat of climate change, but the communist lane of solution to them is not prevalent enough. It is as if we hold the solution in our hands, but the masses who see the problem looming over their heads might not listen to us long enough to allow us to give it to them. Žižek also draws a distinction between socialism and communism, saying that there can be no anti-Semitism in communism, but there can be socialist anti-Semitism, for example, and that socialism seeks to solve the first three antagonisms while leaving the fourth unsolved. The future will be communist or socialist, Žižek claims, and his essential lane towards a communist victory is an interesting one that is rooted in solidarity. This lane that he proposes we take is one where our proletariat, currently fractured fractionated into three groups that Žižek describes as the intellectual laborers, the Hegelian universal, the old manual laborers, the Hegelian particular, and the societal outcasts, the Hegelian singular, unites in a unity that is the victory. This is obviously a nigh impossible task, as each fraction possesses prejudices for the others, as Žižek points out, but I think it would constitute a win for us communists indeed.